The day Ruth Baker walked into the land office in Dusty Creek, Texas, with a leather deed folder pressed against her chest like a shield, every man in that room found something to laugh about. It was the spring of 1879, and the frontier was still a place where a woman could own everything she needed to survive and still be told, with great confidence and very little shame, that she owned nothing at all. Dusty Creek sat in the hill country of central Texas, a rough-edged town of maybe 400 souls, most of them stubborn, most of them suspicious, and most of them operating under the comfortable assumption that the world worked exactly the way they believed it did. The land office smelled of old paper and pipe tobacco, and the particular mustiness of men who spent their days stamping documents and denying things. Ruth had walked through that door before. She had walked through it 3 times in the past 2 weeks, and each time she had been turned away with a condescending smile and a vague suggestion that perhaps she had misread the paperwork. She had not misread the paperwork. Ruth was 26 years old, dark-haired and sharp-eyed, with calloused hands that told the story of a woman who had worked her father's land since she was tall enough to hold a hoe. Her father, Thomas Baker, had died of a fever the previous autumn, leaving behind 40 acres of good grazing land on the eastern ridge outside Dusty Creek, a mule named Captain, a barn that needed its roof patched, and a properly witnessed and notarized deed that transferred the land in full to his only surviving child. Ruth had read that deed so many times she could recite it from memory. She had studied every line of it, traced every signature with her fingertip, and knew without any shadow of doubt that the land was hers. Thomas Baker had been a careful man. He did not make mistakes with paperwork. The trouble was that Harlan Cook wanted that land. Harlan Cook was the kind of man who smiled with all his teeth and meant nothing good by it. He owned the largest cattle operation in the county, and he had been eyeing the Baker Ridge for 3 years because the stream that cut through its eastern pasture was the cleanest water source between his south range and the river crossing at Miller's Ford. Thomas Baker had turned down his offers twice, politely the first time, and with considerably less politeness the second. Thomas Baker was gone now, and Harlan Cook had apparently decided that a young woman alone was a problem much easier to solve than a stubborn old farmer. The men in the land office laughed, as men in land offices often did when they thought the situation called for it, and Ruth stood her ground the way she always did, which was to say she stood very still, looked at each man with an expression that conveyed exactly how little she thought of them, and waited for the noise to stop. It took a while. There were 4 of them, not counting the clerk behind the counter, whose name was Pettit and who wore spectacles that sat crooked on his nose. 2 of the laughing men were ranchers she recognized from church. One was a lawyer named Dobbs who worked for Harlan Cook and who had no business being in the land office that afternoon unless someone had tipped him off that Ruth would be there. The 4th man was someone she did not know, and he was not laughing. She noticed him the way you notice stillness in a room full of noise. He was leaning against the far wall with his hat pushed back on his head, arms crossed, watching the whole scene with the kind of measured attention that did not belong to a man who found the situation amusing. He was tall, broad in the shoulders, with dark brown hair and a jaw that looked like it had been cut from the same limestone that made up the ridge on her father's land. He wore a working man's clothes, dusty from the trail, a colt on his hip that sat like it was part of him, and an expression that was thoughtful in a way that made her feel, for reasons she could not immediately explain, slightly less alone. The clerk, Pettit, composed himself enough to speak. "Miss Baker, as I have explained before, the deed you are presenting requires additional verification before we can process any formal registration. The county recorder's office has not yet." "The county recorder's office," Ruth said, and her voice was quiet but it carried the way a bell carries, "has had 3 weeks. My father's deed was witnessed by Judge Alderman himself and notarized in this county. There is nothing irregular about it except for the fact that the man who wants my land has friends in this office, and all of you know it. Dobbs, the lawyer, cleared his throat. "Now, Miss Baker, nobody is suggesting that your father's intentions were. His intentions are written down," Ruth said. "They are written down clearly, and they are legally binding. I am not asking anyone to guess at his intentions. I am asking for what the law requires, which is the registration of a lawful deed." More laughter from the ranchers. One of them said something under his breath that she did not quite hear but understood the nature of. Pettit polished his crooked spectacles and looked extremely uncomfortable. Dobbs began constructing some elaborate legal argument about verification procedures and contested estate proceedings, and Ruth felt the familiar cold fury settling in her chest, the one that had been living there since the morning after her father's funeral, when Cook's foreman had ridden up to her door and told her, with that same tooth-bearing smile, that she might want to think about selling, while the offer was still on the table. The man against the wall pushed himself upright. He did not raise his voice. He did not make a dramatic entrance. He simply walked across the room, stood beside Ruth, and looked at Pettit with the kind of calm that meant he was very accustomed to being the most serious person in any given situation. "Can I see the deed?" he asked Ruth. She looked at him. Every instinct she had spent the last 6 months honing told her to be careful. Men who stepped in had a habit of stepping in for their own reasons. But there was something about the way he had asked, the simple directness of it, the fact that he had addressed her and not Pettit, the fact that he had said, "Can I see it?" rather than "Why don't you let me handle this?" that made her pull the deed from the folder and hand it to him. He read it. He actually read it. He took his time with it, turned it over to check the notarization on the back, held it up slightly to look at the paper quality, and read it again. Ruth watched his face while he read. It did not change much, but she saw the small shift when he reached the witnessing signature, the slight tightening around his eyes that told her he recognized what he was looking at. He handed it back to her. "That's a clean deed," he said. "Judge Alderman's signature, notary seal from Bastrop County. Witnessed by 2 independent parties." He turned to Pettit. "What's the procedural justification for the delay?" Pettit blinked. "I beg your pardon. You heard her," the man said. "What's the specific procedural reason this deed has not been registered? Give me the code section you're relying on." Pettit opened his mouth. Dobbs started to say something. The man turned to look at Dobbs with an expression that was entirely neutral and somehow more intimidating for it, and Dobbs stopped talking. "I'm Eli Weston," the man said to Ruth, not quietly, not as an aside, but plainly, as if the introduction mattered and deserved to be made in front of everyone. "I've been a land surveyor in this territory for 6 years. I can tell you right now that deed is valid, and this registration should have been completed 3 weeks ago." Ruth looked at him for a moment. Then she looked back at Pettit. "You heard him," she said. The registration took another 40 minutes because Pettit was the kind of man who moved slowly when he was uncomfortable and even more slowly when he was embarrassed, but it happened. Dobbs left. The 2 ranchers drifted out soon after, their amusement having curdled into something quieter and less comfortable. Ruth stood at the counter and watched every stamp, every signature, every line of ink, until the Baker Ridge land was registered in her name in the official records of Comanche County, Texas. When it was done, she walked outside into the late afternoon sun and breathed. Eli Weston came out a few minutes later. He stopped on the boardwalk beside her, replaced his hat on his head, and squinted out at the dusty main street of Dusty Creek. "Thank you," Ruth said. "I didn't do much," he said. "You had the deed." "I've had the deed for 3 weeks," she said. "That's the difference." He nodded, and she could see him thinking that over, taking it seriously the way he had taken the deed seriously, not brushing it aside, not offering her some reassurance that things would all work out, just absorbing the fact of it. "Are you going to have trouble now?" he asked. "With Cook?" She turned to look at him. "How do you know about Cook?" "I've been in town 4 days doing a survey contract on the Miller property. Cook's name comes up a lot when people talk about land disputes in this county." He paused. "And Dobbs works for him." "Yes," Ruth said. "I'm going to have trouble with Cook." She said it plainly because it was plain. There was no use decorating the truth, but I have had trouble before. Eli looked at her then, not the way men usually looked at her, which was to say not with that particular combination of patronizing sympathy and assessment that she had come to recognize and despise. He looked at her the way he had looked at the deed, carefully, like he was reading something that mattered and wanted to understand it correctly. "Do you have help on the land?" he asked. "I have Captain," she said. "Is Captain a person? Captain is a mule." Something shifted in his expression, almost a smile, but not quite. "Right," he said. They stood there for a moment in the cooling air of the Texas afternoon, dust moving down the street in the wake of a passing wagon, and Ruth Baker thought, with the clarity that sometimes arrived in moments you least expected it, that this was the first time in a very long time that she had stood next to someone and not felt entirely alone. She did not say that. She was a practical woman, and the afternoon was getting long, and there were chores waiting at the ridge. She told Eli Weston it was nice to meet him, tucked her deed folder back under her arm, and walked to where her horse was tied at the rail. She rode home thinking about the way he had read that deed. The Baker Ridge in spring was the kind of beautiful that made you believe the world had been made with some good intention. The wildflowers came up in the lower pasture first, bluebonnets and Indian paintbrush in colors so saturated they looked almost invented, and the stream that cut through the eastern edge ran clear and cold over white limestone rocks that flashed in the sun like scattered coins. Ruth's father had built the house from that same limestone, thick-walled and practical, set on a rise where you could see 3 directions, and the wind came through the windows in the evening smelling of cedar and rain. She turned Captain out in the pasture, patched the fence rail that had been loose since February, and made her supper alone in the kitchen where her father's coffee cup still sat on the shelf exactly where he had always kept it. She did not move it. She had not moved it since October, and she was not ready to move it yet. That night she sat at the kitchen table with a lantern and went through the deed one more time, checking every notation against the list Eli Weston had named aloud in the land office. The witnessing signatures, the notary seal, Judge Alderman's careful handwriting at the bottom. It was all there, it had always been all there, and it was registered now, officially, and Harlan Cook would have to find another way to make her life difficult. She blew out the lantern and went to bed thinking she had heard the last of Eli Weston, which was not the saddest thought she had ever had, but was sadder than she expected. She was wrong about hearing the last of him. 3 mornings after the land office, Ruth was repairing the stone fence along the north pasture when she heard a horse coming up the ridge road. She straightened, shaded her eyes with her forearm, and watched a rider come up through the cedar scrub at an easy walk. When she recognized the shape of him, the particular way he sat a horse, relaxed but attentive, like a man who was always ready to move but never in a hurry, she felt something shift in her chest that she did not immediately have a name for. Eli Weston stopped his horse at the fence line and looked down at her, and then at the stone work she was doing, and then back at her. "You're building that corner wrong," he said. Ruth put one hand on her hip. "I beg your pardon, the cornerstone. You've got the weight bearing on the wrong side. It'll hold for a season, and then the whole north section will walk downhill." She looked at the corner, then she looked at him. "Are you a surveyor or a stonemason?" "My father was a stonemason," he said, and swung down from the horse. "I've been meaning to come out here." "Have you?" she said. "I finished my survey contract yesterday. I'm not due back in Austin until the end of the month." He stopped on the other side of the fence and looked at her with that same direct steadiness she had noticed in the land office. "I thought you might have use for an extra pair of hands." Ruth Baker had spent the better part of 6 months doing everything alone. She had made peace with that, or at least something that resembled peace, which is what you make when peace is what's required. She had mended fence and repaired the barn, and turned the lower pasture for spring planting, and driven Captain to town for supplies, and done all of it without asking for help from anyone. Because asking for help had a way of turning into owing people things. And owing people things in Dusty Creek in 1879 had a way of making you vulnerable in ways you could not always anticipate. But there was the north fence corner, bearing its weight wrong, and there was Eli Weston on the other side of it, and there was the work to be done. "There's coffee on the stove," she said. "We can start with the corner." They worked the whole morning on that fence. Eli had been right about the cornerstone. He reset it without making a production of being right, which she appreciated, and showed her the principle behind it in a way that felt like instruction rather than correction. Ruth asked questions, and he answered them without any of the impatience or condescension that questions from women usually received from men in her experience. By the time the sun was high enough to make the back of her neck hot, she had learned something genuinely useful, and the fence corner sat solid and correct against the Texas hillside. They took their lunch in the shade of the cedar outside the barn, bread and dried beef, and the last of the pickled cucumbers from her root cellar, and Eli asked her how long she had worked the land with her father. She told him about growing up on the ridge, about her mother dying when she was 9, about learning everything practical from Thomas Baker, who believed that a person should know how to do every job that needed doing on their own land. She told him about the land dispute, more of it than she had intended, the 2 years of Cook's pressure and the escalating offers, and the way things had gotten worse after her father's death. Eli listened the way he did everything, which was completely. He did not interrupt. He did not offer opinions when she was still in the middle of facts. He did not look away at the horizon when the story became heavy. "He's going to try again," she said. "The deed registration will slow him down, but it won't stop him. Cook always finds another way." "What does he want the land for specifically?" Eli asked. "The stream," she said. "That stream is the cleanest water source between his South Range and Miller's Ford. In a dry summer, his cattle need it." Eli nodded, turning that over. "Have you thought about posting the boundary? Formal fencing along the stream corridor, clear markers?" "I've thought about it. I don't have the money for full fencing along the eastern edge." "You don't need full fencing," he said. "You need enough that any interference with it constitutes a clear legal trespass. 4 strands of wire with registered boundary markers every 100 yards. I can help you survey and mark it properly. If Cook's men come onto that property after it's clearly marked, you have a case that a county judge would have to take seriously." Ruth looked at him. "Why are you offering to do this?" It was a direct question, and she asked it directly, because she did not believe in dancing around things that mattered. She needed to understand what this man's offer cost, what it was attached to, what it expected in return. Eli met her eyes. "Because I was in that land office and I watched 4 men laugh at a woman who had done everything right, and I watched a lawyer who works for a man who wants her property try to use the law to take what wasn't his." He paused. "And because I'm a land surveyor and I have 3 weeks and I can be of use." There was nothing in his face that was performing anything. He was not trying to look noble, he was just telling her the truth. "All right," Ruth said. "We can start on the eastern boundary tomorrow." Those first days working the land together settled into a rhythm that felt, to Ruth, like something she had not known she was missing. Eli Weston was practical and capable and efficient, which she respected. He was also, she discovered slowly, funny in a way that snuck up on you, dry and quiet, observations delivered in passing that she found herself thinking about hours later and laughing at alone in the kitchen. He was good with Captain, who was deeply suspicious of strangers and had once bitten a circuit preacher on the shoulder, and the fact that the mule accepted Eli's presence within 2 days struck Ruth as significant testimony of character. She was careful with herself. She had learned to be careful. A woman alone on land that other people wanted had limited tolerance for carelessness, especially of the emotional variety. She watched Eli Weston work and she noticed things about him. The way he was thorough without being slow, the way he treated the land itself with a kind of respect she recognized from her father, the way he never raised his voice, and she filed those observations away somewhere practical and tried not to attach too much feeling to them. She was not entirely successful. On the fourth evening, he was helping her on the ridge. They finished setting the last of the eastern boundary markers as the sun was going down, and the light on the hill country was the particular gold that makes you feel like you are standing inside something beautiful and temporary. Ruth was hammering the final post stake when her hammer glanced off the stake wrong and caught the side of her palm, and she said something under her breath that she would not have said in her father's house, and Eli turned and took her hand before she had time to think about it, and looked at the cut along the heel of her palm with that same careful attention he gave everything. "It's nothing," she said. "It's not nothing," he said, which was also true. He pulled a clean cloth from his back pocket, the kind of thing she had noticed he always had, a man who was prepared in small practical ways, and wrapped her palm with it and tied it neatly without making her feel injured or managed. His hands were warm and sure, and the care in them was so matter-of-fact and so genuine that Ruth had to look away at the horizon to compose herself. "Thank you," she said. "How long have you been doing all of this alone?" He asked. He was still holding her wrapped hand loosely, not quite letting go. "Since October," she said. "Since my father died." "Before that, too," he said. "Not the same kind of alone, but still." She turned back to look at him and found his eyes on her, steady and dark in the fading light, and the question in them was the same kind of question that good deeds ask, the kind that want to know the actual answer. "Yes," she said. "Before that, too." They stood there for a moment in the last of the golden light, with the smell of cedar and warming stone all around them. And Ruth Baker, who had not cried since the day after her father's funeral, and had been quietly proud of that fact, felt something loosen in her chest in a way that had nothing to do with sadness, and everything to do with the strange and frightening relief of being seen. Eli released her hand gently, which she was grateful for because she needed to breathe, and they walked back to the house through the dusk in companionable silence, which was, she thought, the best kind. That night he rode back to the boarding house in town where he was staying, and Ruth sat at the kitchen table and thought about him for a long time before she admitted to herself what she was doing and made herself go to bed. The trouble from Cook came in the third week, as she had known it would. Ruth was in town buying flour and lamp oil, when she heard from the woman who ran the dry goods store, Mrs. Halloran, who knew everything that happened in Dusty Creek, because everything that happened in Dusty Creek eventually needed something from the dry goods store, that Harlan Cook had filed some kind of legal challenge through Dobbs's office. Mrs. Halloran did not know the specifics, only that there had been a rider to the courthouse that morning and that Dobbs had been seen going in and out of Cook's office with a face that looked like it was planning something. Ruth walked to the courthouse with her flour and her lamp oil still under her arm, which was not the ideal way to deal with legal proceedings, but was what she had available. The county clerk's office was a small room off the main hall, and the clerk, a thin young man named Preston who was not yet old enough to have developed the comfortable complacency of Pettit, was behind the counter looking harried. She asked about the filing. It was, as she had suspected, a challenge to the estate proceedings. Dobbs had filed a claim on behalf of Cook's Land Company, asserting that Thomas Baker had carried an undisclosed debt to Cook at the time of his death, a debt that, under the terms of an alleged agreement, secured against the eastern 40 acres of the Baker property. There was a document attached that purported to be a promissory note signed by Thomas Baker 18 months before his death. Ruth read it twice. Then she said in a very controlled voice, "My father had no debt to Harlan Cook." Preston looked uncomfortable. The document is a fabrication," Ruth said. "My father kept meticulous records of every financial transaction he ever made. I have those records. He never borrowed a dollar from Harlan Cook, and he never would have. He would have sold Captain first." She walked out of the courthouse and stood in the street and thought clearly and practically about what she needed to do, which was what she always did when she was frightened. She had learned from her father that fear was useful when it made you think faster and dangerous when it made you stop thinking altogether, and she intended to keep thinking. She needed a lawyer. She did not have the money for Dobbs's equivalent, but there was a man named Garretson who had an office on the south end of Main Street who had helped her father with a water rights dispute years ago, and who did not, as far as she knew, have any connection to Cook. She found Eli before she found Garretson, which she had not planned. He was coming out of the feed store when he saw her face and stopped. "What happened?" he said. She told him. He listened, and when she was finished he said, "Show me the note they filed." "I don't have a copy. Preston read it to me." "We need a copy, and we need to look at your father's financial records tonight." He was already moving, thinking ahead, the same methodical competence she had watched him apply to fence lines and boundary surveys and stone corners applied now to this. "Garretson is a good man. I've met him. We go to him first, then we get the copy of the filed document." She noticed he said "we." She was very grateful for it, and did not say so. They spent the afternoon at Garretson's office, a small room that smelled of cigars and old paper, with the lawyer reading the copy of the promissory note that Preston had reluctantly produced and making sounds that suggested he found it interesting in a way that was not at all flattering to whoever had written it. Garretson was a heavy-set man in his 50s with a gray beard and small, clever eyes, and he had a way of getting to the heart of things that Ruth found reassuring. "This note has a problem," Garretson said, tapping the document. "See this date, March of '77, your father's signature. But look at the pen pressure and the formation of the B in Baker. Your father was right-handed." He looked at Ruth. "Strongly," she said. "He wrote every letter with the same consistent hand." "The B in this signature angles left," Garretson said. "It's subtle, but it's consistent with a right-handed person trying to simulate another right-handed person's signature. Not your father writing his own name. Someone else writing Thomas Baker." Ruth felt something cold and satisfying settle in her chest. "Can you prove that?" "I can get a handwriting expert from Austin," Garretson said. "More importantly, you said he kept financial records." "Everything," Ruth said. "Every transaction since 1863. He kept ledger books. If those ledgers show no transaction with Cook in March of '77, that's the foundation of the defense," Garretson said. "I'll file to challenge the authenticity of the note. That buys us time and puts the burden back on Cook to prove it's real." He looked at Eli. "You're the surveyor." "I've been helping Miss Baker with the boundary surveys," Eli said. "Good. Keep those markers documented, date them, have a witness, record everything formally. If this goes to a full hearing, we want a clean paper trail on everything touching that property." They rode back to the ridge in the long summer evening, Ruth and Eli side by side on the road that wound up through the cedar scrub, and she was quiet most of the way thinking through what needed to be done. The ledger books were in the house. Her father had kept them in the roll-top desk in the room he had used as a study. She had not opened that room much since his death. There were his books and his tools and the particular organization of his life that she had not been ready to disturb. "You all right?" Eli asked as they came up the last rise. "I'm thinking," she said. "I know," he said. "I could tell." She looked at him. "How?" "You go quiet a certain way when you're working through something, different from ordinary quiet." He said it without any self-consciousness, just observation. Ruth considered that, the idea that this man had been paying close enough attention to her silences to distinguish between them, and felt the warmth of it settle somewhere it did not immediately let go. "My father's study," she said. "I haven't spent much time in there. The ledgers will be in the desk." "Do you want me to wait outside while you find them?" She thought about it. She thought about her father's study and the coffee cup still on the kitchen shelf, and the way grief had a habit of sitting in rooms as much as in people. She said, "You can come in." The ledgers were exactly where they should have been. Her father had been, as she said, meticulous. The 1877 volume was read with a cloth spine, and Ruth found March of that year within minutes, running her finger down the neat columns of her father's careful writing. There was a transaction with the hardware supplier in Burnett. There was the purchase of 3 new fence posts. There was a payment to the farrier for Captain. There was no transaction with Harlan Cook. There was no promissory note. There was nothing to suggest that Thomas Baker had ever had a financial relationship with Cook beyond turning down his land offers, which were not recorded in the ledger but were recorded in the letters Ruth had found in the study's side drawer, two formal letters from Cook's office and her father's draft responses, declining clearly and on record. "There it is," Eli said quietly, leaning over her shoulder to look at the ledger. His voice was close and she could feel the warmth of him. "There it is," she agreed. She brought the ledgers to Garretson the next morning, and he spent the better part of that day with them before sending word that he was ready to file the challenge. The handwriting expert he requested was available to come from Austin within 2 weeks. The legal machinery was in motion, slow and grinding as it was, and Cook would have to account for his fabricated note in front of a county judge. That night, sitting on the porch of the farmhouse with the Texas darkness all around, and the stars so thick and close they seemed almost to make a sound, Ruth told Eli about her father. Not the facts of him, which she had already shared, but the person of him. She told him about the way Thomas Baker had taught her to read a deed and a survey map and a land record, sitting at that same kitchen table with a lantern between them. She told him about how her father had believed that a woman had as much right to understand her own property as any man, which had been, in Comanche County in the 1870s, a belief he had occasionally had to defend with considerable stubbornness. She told him about the last summer, how her father had known by late August that the fever was going to win, and how he had spent those last weeks making sure every record was in order, every paper properly filed, every account settled, because he had understood what would happen if he left his daughter with any ambiguity in the legal documentation of her land. "He was preparing me," she said. "He knew what the world was going to be like for me after he was gone. He was trying to make it as navigable as possible." "He sounds like a remarkable man," Eli said. "He was the best man I knew," she said simply. Eli was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "My father built things to last too, buildings, walls. He used to say the point of good work was that it held after you weren't there to hold it yourself." "Yes," Ruth said. "That's exactly it." They sat in the warm darkness, and the silence between them was the kind that had become familiar and welcome, a silence in which she was aware of him beside her, the steadiness of him, the particular quality of his presence that had become in the past 3 weeks something she oriented herself by the way you orient yourself by a fixed star. "Eli," she said. "Yes." "Why did you come back?" She had asked him a version of this before when he first arrived at the fence, and he had answered it practically. She was asking something different now, and they both understood that. "You could have finished your survey contract and gone back to Austin. You had no obligation here." He turned to look at her. The starlight was enough to see by barely. "No," he said, "I didn't have an obligation. So why? Because I walked out of that land office and watched you ride away and thought about the fact that you were going back to that land by yourself and Cook was going to come at you again and you didn't have anyone in your corner." He paused. "And because I couldn't stop thinking about you." Ruth looked at him for a long time. "That's 2 different reasons," she said. "Yes," he said. "They're both true." She thought about all the things she could say, the careful things, the practical things, the things designed to protect the particular closed and self-sufficient world she had constructed around herself in the past 6 months. She thought about them, and then she thought about the way he had read that deed and the way he had taken her hand when the hammer slipped, and the way he could tell the difference between her silences. "I couldn't stop thinking about you either," she said. Neither of them said anything else for a moment. Then Eli reached over and took her hand, the unwrapped one, and held it with the same quiet sureness he held everything. And Ruth Baker looked up at the thick Texas sky and felt something in her chest open that had been closed for a very long time. The legal hearing on Cook's fabricated promissory note came in late June, on a Wednesday morning when the Texas heat had already settled in like something permanent, and the courthouse was full because, in a small town, a land dispute between a widow and the wealthiest cattleman in the county was the kind of event that drew an audience. Garretson was prepared. The handwriting expert from Austin, a sharp-eyed woman named Dr. Carver, who had testified in estate proceedings across the state, laid out her analysis of the promissory note's signature with the kind of methodical clarity that made the courtroom very quiet. The B in Baker, the left angle, the pressure differential. She compared it, line by line, to 3 authenticated samples of Thomas Baker's handwriting, including a letter he had written to the county assessor in 1876, on file in the county records, and the difference was plain to anyone who looked. Garretson put Ruth on the stand, and she presented the 1877 ledger with the same composure she had shown in the land office 2 months ago, pointing to the absence of any transaction with Cook in March, April, or any other month of that year. She was calm and precise, and she answered every question Dobbs asked on cross-examination with the same direct clarity, and she watched Dobbs's case dissolve in front of her like old paper in rain. The judge, a man named Harwick who had a reputation for irritability but not for corruption, looked at the promissory note and the handwriting analysis and the ledger and the authenticated letter and dismissed Cook's claim. He did it with the economy of a man who had seen too many such claims and was tired of them. He also made a comment, not required by the ruling but clearly intended for the record, that documents filed with the court were expected to be authentic, and that the filing of fraudulent instruments was a matter the court took seriously. Cook himself was not in the courtroom. He sent Dobbs, who took the ruling with the face of a man absorbing a blow he had not entirely expected, and walked out without making eye contact with anyone. Ruth stood on the courthouse steps afterward in the full force of the Texas sun and let herself feel the victory. Not triumphantly, not loudly, but she let herself feel it because she had earned it and her father had built toward it and it was real. Eli was beside her. He had been in the courtroom the whole morning, sitting in the gallery, steady and present, and now he was beside her on the steps with his hat in his hands and an expression on his face that she had learned to read, which was the expression that meant he was genuinely, quietly glad. "It's done," she said. "For now," he said, which was honest. "For now," she agreed, "but the record is clear, the deed is registered, the fabricated note is dismissed." He would have to find something very creative to come at this again through legal channels. He might come at it through other channels, Eli said carefully. Ruth turned to look at him. "I know," she thought about that for a moment. "I'll deal with that if it comes, but today this is done and I am going to let it be done for today." He smiled then, the full version of it, which she had seen only a few times and which transformed his face in a way that made her feel warm in a manner that had nothing to do with the June sun. "That's probably wise," he said. "Mrs. Halloran from the dry goods store came up the steps to congratulate her, and then a few other townspeople, and Ruth shook hands and accepted kind words, and noticed that the 2 ranchers from the land office were present but did not approach her, which she took as a form of acknowledgement. Not an apology, not a reckoning, but an acknowledgement, which was what you got in 1879, and she was practical enough to recognize it as something. They rode back to the ridge together, and Ruth made a real supper for the first time in a long time. Not just bread and dried meat, but a proper meal with the last of the spring vegetables from the kitchen garden, and a chicken that had been living on borrowed time anyway. And they ate at the table in the kitchen, while the evening light came through the window and fell across the old wood and the coffee cup that still sat on its shelf. After supper, she told Eli about the cup. She had not told him that story yet, the way it was still sitting there, because she was not ready to move it, and he listened the way he always did, and then he said, very gently, "You don't have to move it until you want to." "I know," she said, "but I think I'm almost ready." "There's no rush," he said. "No," she said, "but things change. Life asks you to make room." She looked at him across the table, and he was looking back at her with an openness that she had come to understand was just the particular way he was with her, the particular permission he gave himself to look without guarding it, and she thought that she loved him. She thought it with the same clarity she had always applied to deeds and ledgers and boundary surveys, plainly and without decoration. She did not say it yet, because there were things that still needed to happen, things that needed to be built and marked the way you marked a property line, clearly and on record. But she thought it and held on to it, and it was warm. The summer deepened and Eli's 3 weeks extended, which they both understood was a choice and treated accordingly. He rode back to Austin once to renegotiate his contract timeline, and he was gone for 4 days that were longer than 4 days had any business being. And when he came back up the ridge road on a Thursday evening with his horse dusty from the trail and his hat pushed back the way it was when he had been riding a long time, Ruth put down what she was doing and walked to the fence and waited. And when he stopped his horse and looked at her, he did not say anything for a moment, and neither did she, and then they were both smiling like people who have been given something they were not entirely sure they deserved. 4 days is a long time, she said. 4 days is too long, he said, and swung down, and that was the first time he kissed her, standing at the fence in the evening light with Captain looking on from the pasture with the specific expression of a mule who has decided something was inevitable. It was a good kiss. It was a careful and certain kiss, the kind that comes from someone who knows what they want and is sure enough to be gentle about it, and Ruth had her hands on the front of his shirt by the end of it and did not let go right away. "I should have done that 2 weeks ago," he said. "You should have done it 3 weeks ago," she said. He laughed, and she felt the laugh against her and thought she could spend a good deal of her life standing close enough to feel that particular sound. The summer continued, and the relationship between them deepened in the way of people who are well-suited and honest with each other, without great dramatic declarations, but with the accumulation of small truths and shared days and the particular comfort of being known. Eli helped her with the hay cutting, and she helped him with a survey contract he was completing near the Miller property, walking the lines beside him and learning to use the transit level, and he showed her how to read a topographic drawing the way her father had shown her to read a deed, as if her understanding mattered, as if her competence was something to be cultivated rather than replaced. Cook's foreman, a lean man named Garvey, rode past the eastern boundary twice in late July, slowly enough that it was clearly an act of observation. Ruth noted the dates, and Eli documented the positions relative to the marked boundary line. Nothing crossed the markers. Garvey never set foot on Baker land, but the rides were a message and Ruth understood them as such and wrote them down. One evening in August, sitting on the porch after a day of work that had left them both sun-worn and tired in the pleasant way, Eli said, "I've been offered a contract in Abilene." Ruth was quiet for a moment. "Abilene," she said. "Survey work for a new railroad branch. It's a big contract. Several months." "That's good work," she said carefully. "It is," he said. "I haven't taken it." "Why not?" He turned to look at her. "Because I want to ask you something first." Ruth Baker set down the cup of coffee she had been holding and looked at Eli Weston across the porch, across the evening, across the 3 months of shared work and shared silences and shared laughter, and waited. "I know this land is yours," he said. "I know it was your father's before you and that you have bled for it and fought for it, and that it is not separate from you, it's part of you. I'm not asking you to give any of that up or change any of it." He paused, and she could see him being careful with words, the same care he applied to survey work, getting the measurement right before he committed it to record. "I'm asking if I can be part of it, if I can be part of your life. Not to take anything over or manage anything, just because there isn't anywhere I want to be except where you are." Ruth thought about her father's belief that a person should be able to do every job that needed doing on their own land. She thought about the 6 months alone, and the particular pride of that, and the particular loneliness of it too. She thought about the way it felt to have someone beside her who did not diminish her but enlarged the space she moved in. "The Abilene contract," she said. "How long?" 3 months, he said. "Maybe 4. "Could you write?" she asked. He blinked, and then a smile broke across his face like dawn. "I can write every week," he said. "I need the eastern fence reinforced before October," she said, "before you leave." "We can do it in 2 weeks," he said. "Then yes," she said. "Come back after Abilene, and yes to the other thing too." He crossed the porch in 2 steps and took her face in his hands and kissed her in a way that was different from the fence-line kiss, deeper and more decided. And she held on to him and thought about the word yes and all the things it meant, the sensible ones and the terrifying ones, and the ones she did not have language for yet. They reinforced the eastern fence in 10 days, working in the August heat from first light to last, and they were good days, full days, the kind you remember afterward as having lasted longer than they actually did. When the fence was done, Eli helped her put up the storm shutters on the barn and stack the winter cordwood and repair the kitchen roof where a corner had been pulling loose since spring. He worked like a man who was leaving things right behind him, which was what he was doing. His last night on the ridge before heading to Abilene, they sat on the porch again with the August stars over them, and Ruth told him she loved him. She said it the way she said things that mattered, plainly and without decoration, and he said it back the same way, and neither of them said anything else for a while because the words were sufficient, and the night was warm and quiet and full. He left the next morning. She watched him ride down the ridge road from the porch, his figure growing small against the cedar scrub, and stood there until she could not see him any more. And then she went inside and sat at the kitchen table and took her father's coffee cup down from the shelf and held it for a long time. Then she washed it carefully and put it in the cabinet with the rest of her dishes, and felt her father's presence in the room shift slightly, like a nod. The autumn without Eli had its own rhythms. His letters came regularly, as promised, every week, arriving with the Tuesday mail on the stage road. They were long letters, full of the specifics of Abilene, the survey work and the railroad engineers, and the particular strangeness of a cattle town in full fall operation, but also full of observations about things that reminded him of her and questions about the ridge and Captain and the eastern pasture, and how the wildflowers had done in the lower field. He wrote well. He wrote like a man who was accustomed to precision, but had learned to use it for something more than measurement. She wrote back every week, filling pages with the news of the land and the news of the town and the small things that accumulated in a life lived closely to a place. She wrote about the first frost and the way the hills looked under it, silver gold in the early morning. She wrote about a dispute with Garvey, Cook's foreman, who had tried to argue that the stream water rights extended to the land on the other side of the eastern boundary, a claim that she had countered with a formal letter from Garretson that Garvey had not bothered to argue further. She wrote about the night a coyote got into the henhouse and her and Captain's enthusiastic, if ultimately unsuccessful, pursuit. She wrote, in one letter, that the house was large in the evenings and that she had taken to reading aloud to herself at the kitchen table, which was not the same as having someone to read to, but was better than total silence. She heard through Mrs. Halloran, who heard through the kind of lateral communication that operated in small towns with the efficiency of telegraph, that Harlan Cook had been having a difficult autumn. The beef prices had dropped and his south range was drying out as she had predicted, and without the Baker stream, he was hauling water to his cattle at significant expense. 2 of his hands had left for better paying work on a spread up near Waco. Cook was not ruined. Men like Cook were rarely ruined in any quick or satisfying way, but he was uncomfortable, and Ruth gathered this information with the specific satisfaction of a woman who had held her ground against a man who had believed her incapable of it. Eli's contract ran long, as these things did. 3 months became 4, and 4 threatened to become 5. But in the last week of November she received a letter saying he would be back on the ridge before December's first week, and she received this information with a dignity that lasted approximately until she was out of Mrs. Halloran's sight, at which point she walked to the hitching post where her horse was tied and leaned her forehead against the animal's neck and permitted herself a moment of completely undignified happiness. He came back on a cold, clear Thursday, riding up the ridge road in the early afternoon with his breath making white plumes in the December air, and she was in the lower pasture checking the fence line and saw him coming and walked up through the field to meet him. And he swung down before the horse had quite stopped, and they held on to each other in the cold air for a long time without saying anything, which was, she thought, the best kind of reunion. He looked thinner. He looked tired in the way of a man who had been working hard in a hard place, but his eyes when he pulled back to look at her were the same, steady and dark and completely present. "4 months," she said. "I know," he said. "I'm sorry." "The fence held," she said. He laughed. "I know it did." They went inside and she made coffee and they sat at the table and talked for 3 hours straight, filling in everything the letters had not managed to carry, and Captain was visible through the kitchen window, repeatedly passing the barn in a way that suggested the mule was aware something significant had returned to the property. Eli stayed. That was the simple fact of it. He sent his transit level and his surveying equipment to Dusty Creek by freight wagon, and accepted a contract with the county land office, who needed a qualified surveyor for the boundary work building up as more settlers came into the hill country. And he paid Mrs. Halloran for his room through December while he and Ruth discussed, practically, and with the same honest directness they brought to everything, what the future looked like. He asked her to marry him on Christmas Day, sitting on the porch in the cold with the cedar smelling of rain and frost, and he did it without ceremony or speech, just with his eyes on hers and the question plain between them. And she said yes the way she always said the things that mattered, clearly and without decoration, and he put a ring on her finger that he had carried from Abilene and back, a simple gold band he had bought in October when he realized he was going to ask her. "You bought that in October," she said, looking at it on her hand. "I knew in September," he said. "I needed a month to work up to it." "You," she said, "are the most composed man I have ever met." "I had no idea you needed to work up to anything." "I was terrified," he said pleasantly. She looked at him and then laughed, a real laugh, the kind that came from somewhere unguarded, and he watched her laugh with an expression of such undisguised happiness that she had to look at the ring on her finger to compose herself. They were married in January of 1880, in the small white church on the south end of Dusty Creek's Main Street, in front of Garretson and Mrs. Halloran, and a good portion of the town's 400 souls, who had followed the story of Ruth Baker and her land and her deed with considerable interest, and were, she suspected, largely invested in the outcome. She wore her mother's dress, taken in at the shoulders, with bluebonnets that she had pressed and saved from the previous spring woven through the ribbon at her waist, because it was January in Texas and there were no live wildflowers, but she had planned ahead, because she always did. Eli wore a clean suit that fit him correctly and looked at her when she came down the aisle with the same expression she had come to love most, the one that was paying careful attention and was genuinely glad. The circuit preacher who performed the ceremony was not the same one Captain had bitten, which she took as a good omen. After the ceremony, at the small gathering at the Halloran house, Garretson told them that he had received word that Cook's legal challenge to the estate had been formally and finally withdrawn, the last piece of it, and that the county records now showed no encumbrance on the Baker Ridge property of any kind. Ruth received this news with the composure of a woman who had known it was coming and had prepared herself to receive it with grace, and then excused herself to get more coffee and stood in the Halloran kitchen for a moment alone, pressing her hands flat on the cold counter, and said something quiet to her father that was not a prayer and not a goodbye, just an accounting. A settling of the ledger, everything right. She went back out to the party and found Eli at her shoulder before she had crossed the room, because he always knew where she was, and she took his hand. Spring came back to the ridge, and it was different with 2 people in the limestone house, different in the way that things are when someone is there at the beginning of the day and the end of it, when the house fills up with someone else's presence, not overrunning you but running alongside. They worked the land together the way she had worked it alone, but with better efficiency and occasional argument, because they were both capable and opinionated people, and did not always agree on the best way to approach a fence problem or a planting schedule. And those arguments were lively and good-natured, and almost always ended in one of them being right and the other being gracious about it. And the one who was right and the one who was gracious rotated fairly equitably between them. Eli's survey work kept him busy through the spring, the county land office contract expanding as the hill country filled with new settlers, and he spent several days a week out on the county roads and pastures. And Ruth ran the ridge in his absence with the confidence of a woman who had been doing it for years, and who had, in the past 12 months, reinforced every fence line and registered every boundary, and settled every legal claim against her property. Garvey stopped riding the eastern boundary in March, and in April she heard that Cook had sold the South Range to a syndicate out of San Antonio that was buying up grazing land throughout the county. The deal required Cook to move his cattle operation north, away from the Baker Ridge entirely, and the stream that had been the cause of 18 months of conflict flowed on through Ruth's eastern pasture, clear and cold, and utterly indifferent to the drama it had caused. That summer, Ruth told Eli she was expecting a child. She told him at the kitchen table, after supper, in the evening light that came through the window and fell on the old wood the way it always had, and she watched his face when she said it, the way the information arrived and settled into him and changed the quality of the light in his eyes. He did not make noise about it or perform a reaction. He stood up from the table and came around and took her hands and held them the way he had held the injured one at the fence line, carefully and with intent, and looked at her with something in his face that she did not have a name for but recognized as the specific joy of a person whose life has arranged itself into something they did not know how to fully deserve. "Are you all right?" he asked. "I am very well," she said. "I wanted to tell you when I was certain." "How long have you been certain?" 2 weeks, she said. He looked at her with that expression. 2 weeks. "I was being careful," she said. "You are always being careful," he said it like it was one of the things he loved most about her, which she believed it was. The pregnancy progressed well through the summer and into the autumn, and Ruth worked the land with appropriate adjustment to her methods and very little adjustment to her stubbornness, which caused some tension with Eli that was the serious kind, not the lively argument kind, because he worried in the specific and thorough way of a person who loved someone deeply, and understood that love made you vulnerable in ways you could not entirely protect. She allowed herself to be worried over to a point, and then had a direct conversation about what she was and was not capable of, and they reached an understanding, as they always did. The baby arrived on the 16th of February, 1881, in the bedroom of the limestone house on the Baker Ridge, with Mrs. Halloran and the doctor from Dusty Creek present, and it was a boy, healthy and loud, with dark hair and his father's wide-set eyes, and they named him Thomas James Weston, Thomas for Ruth's father and James for Eli's, 2 men who had built things to last. Eli held the baby that first night with the same composure he held everything, and with tears running down his face that he did not make any effort to stop, and Ruth lay in the bed watching him with the particular exhaustion of childbirth and the particular fullness of a heart that has been given more than it expected, and thought about all the things that had led to this room on this night, the deed and the land office and the laughter and the one man who did not laugh, and felt the whole shape of it. The way things connect backward and forward and turn out to be part of the same pattern. Captain could be heard in the pasture outside, the particular nighttime sounds of a contented mule, and Ruth thought her father would have found that deeply appropriate. Young Thomas grew the way healthy country children grow, quickly and with loud enthusiasm, pulling himself upright on the kitchen table legs, and then on the porch rails, and then walking in the lower pasture on unsteady legs, while Captain watched with an expression of long-suffering tolerance. He had his father's calm and his mother's stubbornness, which was a combination that Eli observed with the particular amusement of a man who saw it coming. Ruth continued to run the land with expanding capability. She hired a hand in the springs when the workload required it, and she began planting a proper orchard along the south slope of the ridge, apple and pear and peach, which would not bear for several years, but which she planted with the understanding that the best time to plant an orchard was the moment you decided you were staying, and she had decided that years ago. Eli's survey work brought in steady income, and brought him also into contact with the new settlers coming into the hill country, families from the east and families from the south, and families from Mexico who had been in Texas longer than Texas had been a state, all of them trying to navigate land records and boundary disputes and the particular complexity of the frontier. And he did his work with the same thoroughness and fairness he had brought to the Baker Ridge deed 2 years before. He had a reputation in Comanche County for accuracy, and for telling people the truth about their land claims even when the truth was inconvenient, which earned him respect and occasional enmity in roughly equal measure. The town of Dusty Creek grew around them. The stage road became more traveled. There was talk of a rail spur coming through by the mid-'80s, and the land values in the county were shifting in ways that Eli tracked carefully and Ruth tracked with him. The Baker Ridge, with its registered deed and its clear boundary lines and its clean stream, was among the most secure properties in the county, and she had made it so, with her father's careful records and her own refusal to be moved, and the help of one man who had read her deed at face value and believed it. 3 years after Thomas's birth, in the late summer of 1884, Ruth told Eli there would be a second child, and he received this news at the kitchen table again, in the same evening light, and this time she was watching for the tears, and they came as she expected. And she laughed and wiped his face with her apron, and he caught her hand and held it against his cheek, and they stayed like that for a moment, laughing and full, in the house her father had built on the ridge that her father had loved. This baby came in the early spring, a girl with Ruth's dark hair and Eli's light eyes, whom they named Clara Mee, and Thomas, who was 3, regarded his new sister with the scientific interest of a small boy confronted with something he had been told to expect, but found stranger in person than in theory. He decided within 2 days that he approved, and thereafter appointed himself her protector with an enthusiasm that Ruth found both touching and occasionally requiring supervision. By the time Clara Mee was old enough to toddle after her brother in the lower pasture, chasing the painted sky of a Texas afternoon, Ruth Baker Weston had done what her father's house and her father's land had always asked of her, which was to stand fast and tend carefully and trust the things built to last. The deed that had caused all that noise and trouble sat in a cedar box in the roll-top desk in the study, next to her father's ledgers, properly registered and entirely unchallenged. The stream still ran clear through the eastern pasture. The orchard was coming into bearing. The fence lines were straight and permanent, and marked with the accuracy of a man who took his measurements seriously. Captain, ancient and magnificently bad-tempered, had achieved a kind of legendary status on the Baker Ridge, surviving 2 harsh winters and a flood that had come through the creek bottom in the spring of 1883, and which the mule had endured with complete equanimity, standing in the high water with an expression that suggested he had opinions about it. One evening in October, when both children were asleep and the house was quiet and the autumn stars were burning over the hill country the way they did, too bright and too many to be reasonable about, Ruth and Eli sat on the porch in the cooling air, and she thought about that afternoon in the land office, the laughter and the leather folder and the man against the wall who had not laughed. "Do you remember the first thing I thought when I handed you that deed?" she said. Eli turned to look at her. "Tell me." "I thought, this man is either going to take my side or he's going to use the deed for something of his own, and I couldn't tell which. But I handed it to you anyway because the way you asked felt different." "How did it feel different?" She considered it. "You asked to see it, not to handle it, like it belonged to me, and you wanted to understand it, not take charge of it." Eli was quiet for a moment. "Your father did his job," he said finally. "He built something that held. The deed was right. The ledgers were right. All of it was right. I just read it." "You read it and you believed it," she said. That was the part that was not ordinary. He reached over and took her hand, the same hand he had wrapped at the fence line in that other spring that felt like a long time ago and also like yesterday, and held it with the same quiet certainty. "I'm always going to believe you," he said. Ruth Baker looked at the stars over her father's hill country, over the land that had been hers by deed and by birth and by stubbornness and by the long patient work of staying, and felt the full weight of what she had built and kept and been given, and thought it was a very good accounting. The ledger balanced. The land was hers, and the man beside her had known it from the first moment, and the children sleeping inside the limestone house were the future her father had been preparing for, the thing he had been holding the paper together to make possible, and the stream ran on in the eastern pasture through all the seasons that came after, clear and cold and permanent, and the fence lines held, and in the mornings Captain was still in the lower pasture, and the orchard came into full bearing the summer Thomas turned 7. And the whole ridge smelled of apple blossoms in May, and Eli brought Ruth the first apple of the season that year, with the ceremony of a man presenting something he knew was significant, and she took it from his hand and bit into it, and it was sweet, and the children ran in the pasture below, and the Texas sky was the color of a promise kept. Thomas grew up knowing the land the way his grandfather had known it and his mother after, reading deeds and survey maps at the kitchen table with a lantern between them, Eli teaching him the way Ruth's father had taught her, as if competence was something to be given freely. Clara Me grew up knowing it too, and Ruth made certain of that with the same stubbornness her father had made certain of her own education, because the world did not always offer women what they had coming, but preparation was what a good parent could give. When Thomas was 12 and Clara was 9, a new family settled on the ridge to the west. The Caldwells and their eldest daughter was close to Clara's age, and they became fast friends. And the two families became the kind of neighbors who share tools and harvest days, and the particular intimacy of people whose children run between their two properties with the freedom of children who know they are safe. Ruth and the Caldwell woman, Nora, became friends too, the kind of friendship that forms between capable women who recognize each other clearly. Dusty Creek was larger by then, 200 more souls and a proper school, and a doctor who was not the circuit kind, and the rail spur that had been discussed for years, which finally came through in 1887, changing the character of the county in ways that were sometimes good and sometimes complicated, but were always, Ruth thought, better navigated by people who understood what they owned and were prepared to defend it. Harlan Cook died in 1886, quietly, of a heart ailment, leaving his diminished cattle operation to a son who had no particular interest in the Baker Ridge, and who sold the remaining Cook properties within 2 years. Ruth heard the news from Mrs. Halloran, who had heard it from the funeral home, and she sat with it for a while and felt mostly the absence of feeling, which was its own kind of closure. She had spent enough energy on Cook to last her a lifetime, and was glad to spend no more. Garretson retired that same year and held a small dinner for his longtime clients, and Ruth and Eli went, and she told him at the dinner that, without his work on the promissory note challenge, she did not know what would have happened, and he waved her off in the way of men who dislike being thanked but received the thanks anyway and deserved it. In the evenings of those later years, Ruth often sat at her father's desk in the study and went through the cedar box, not from anxiety but from the particular pleasure of things in order, the registered deed and the dismissed court filings and the boundary survey documents in Eli's careful hand. The history of the Baker Ridge on paper, clean and legible and complete, her father's ledgers beside them, the record of a family that had held its land and its ground and its truth, and of the specific miracle of one ordinary afternoon when a man had read a deed and believed it and turned everything that came after into something possible. She could hear Eli in the kitchen, talking to Thomas about something that involved considerable enthusiasm on Thomas's part and measured patience on Eli's. She could hear Clara laughing at whatever Thomas had said. She could hear the mule somewhere outside in the evening pasture, ancient and permanent. Ruth Baker ran her fingers across the notary seal on the deed, the raised impression she had traced 1,000 times, and she thought about her father and what he would make of all of it, the ridge in the October evening and the children in the kitchen, and the man who had first read this deed on a Tuesday afternoon in a musty land office, and handed it back to her and said, "That's a clean deed." She thought Thomas Baker would have been very pleased. She thought that was a good enough accounting for any life. She closed the cedar box and went into the kitchen, and Eli looked up when she came in and smiled the way he always did when she came into a room, like she was the most welcome thing in it. And she sat down at the table where her father had taught her to read, and her children were there, and the lantern was lit, and the hill country night pressed close and warm against the limestone walls, and everything was, in every way that mattered, right where it was supposed to be.